Now, welcome to Debunking Gardening Myths. There are so many variables in gardening that it's hard to know if something really works without serious research and scientific methods. So today, I'm going to debunk some of those myths. And I think many of you will be surprised at some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. At the end of the presentation, I will have a list of resources where this information came from. So you'll be able to see all of that and know that it's all research-based. Now, I'm starting off with a myth that will probably surprise a lot of you. Coffee grounds are acidic and can be used to lower the pH. Well, I'm afraid the reality is that after the coffee grounds are brewed, the pH is closer to neutral, 6.5 to 6.6. Best idea would be to put them in the compost pile. But when you do, you need to be careful that you don't exceed 20% coffee grounds by volume. Now, you can put them directly into your soil as a soil amendment, and I know a lot of people do that. But there is a problem that if you have excess coffee grounds and you apply those before they're composted, that can have some multiple effects on the soil system. The microorganisms that are in the soil, they will tie up that nitrogen temporarily. And the coffee grounds, the residue from the coffee grounds can also suppress the germination and sometimes slow down the growth of the plants. So if you are going to add them directly to the soil, be very careful about how much you add at one time. Now, I've heard this myth a lot. Watering on hot sunny days will burn the plants because the water droplets magnify the sun's rays. Well, I'm afraid the reality is that wet foliage is not susceptible to sunburn. It rains during the summer all around the world, and the plants are just fine. But in the middle of the day, if your plants are showing signs of water stress in the middle of the day, go ahead and water them. They're going to need that water. I know watering in the middle of the day is not ideal, but if they need it, they need it. And you do know that watering early is best, and also watering from the base is best because that also saves water and prevents the spread of diseases. But if you're out there every day and you're monitoring your plants frequently, you will know how much water they need to keep themselves healthy. So you probably won't have to worry about watering them in the middle of the day. Now, for a long time, this is what we were told to do. When you plant a tree or shrub, add amendments to the soil. But the research has shown that when you're adding an amendment to the planting hole, the roots actually may stay just within that amended soil. They are not going to grow out into the native soil. It's going to be like they're growing in a container in the ground. So that means if the roots can't stretch out and grow into the native soil, the roots will probably start circling around the hole, and the tree or the shrub will either be girdled by the roots, or it might even die because the tree itself is going to outgrow the roots. Now, if you have really poor soil and you do need to amend that hole, don't just amend the planting hole. Amend a large area around where you're going to plant that tree or shrub. That way, by the time it grows and it reaches a native soil, those roots will be strong enough to be able to penetrate, and they'll be able to get out into our native soil. Now, here's one that is hard for many people to grasp. A layer of gravel or coarse material in the bottom of a container improves drainage. Well, now that sounds like it would make sense, and actually the opposite happens. The reality is that the gravel will actually hinder the movement of water in the container, and when that happens, it also lessens the area for the root growth. Now, soil scientists have demonstrated that water doesn't move easily from layers of finer textured materials to layers of more coarse materials. Now, if you will look at the photos, you'll see what I mean. The container on the right has gravel in the bottom, and you can see that the water is being held between the potting soil and the gravel. That means that you have less root space for that plant to grow. The photo on the left shows that the water will be held at the bottom of the container. And you can see that there is a lot more room for root growth in that container than there is in the one with the gravel in it. Now, when two different materials come together, textured materials come together, we call it an interfacing. It's an interface. And you will notice some of you are probably saying, well, yeah, but there's still water in the bottom of that container. That's because there is an interface at the bottom of that container. Unless your container dries out completely, you will always have a little bit of water at the bottom. But remember, you're going to have a lot more root space where the potting soil is than you would if you put gravel in the bottom. You also want to know that you need to fill your containers with some really good draining potting soil. You do not want to use our native soil in your containers because it's just it doesn't not allow for enough air circulation. And all containers, of course, do need drainage holes. How about this? Epsom salt will prevent blossom end rot in tomatoes. You probably hear this a lot, and I'm sure many of us have tried this. But the reality is that blossom end rot is caused by a calcium deficiency. Epsom salt contains magnesium, but no calcium. Most of our soils contain enough calcium already, but the only way for plants to take up calcium is through water. So actually, inconsistent watering is the main cause of blossom end rot and not calcium deficiency. So adding Epsom salt to the soil that already has sufficient magnesium in it, it can actually prevent the calcium from being taken up into the plant. Now, did you know that there are actually some tomatoes that are sold as being resistant to blossom end rot? Celebrity and Jet Star are just a couple of those. So if you're having a lot of trouble with blossom end rot, you might want to purchase tomatoes that say that they are resistant to blossom end rot. You also probably, those of you that are gardeners and grow a lot of tomatoes, probably realize that the sauce or paste type tomatoes, they seem to get blossom end rot more than the other types of tomatoes. Okay, so when it's time to plant your tomatoes, be sure that you use consistent watering practices, and that will help prevent the blossom end rot, not adding Epsom salt to the soil. All right, here's a fun one. Ants help peonies bloom. No, actually, the ants are attracted to this sugary nectar that the peonies secrete. What happens is the ants will send out an ant scout looking for food. And when the ant finds a peony that has all this nice sugary nectar on it, she will send out a pheromone to tell the other ants. So all the other ants come and they're all sitting around on top of this peony, eating this nice sweet nectar. Well, what happens is you may get another insect, say a chewing insect that wants to come and chew on your peony plant. Well, all of these ants are going to say, no way, you stay away from my food source. So they are actually going to deter that bad insects from ruining your peonies. So the peonies also, the ants, they're only going to be on that peony temporarily. Pretty soon they're going to be eating all of that sugary nectar that's available there, and then they will leave. So there is no need for a pesticide. So we want to keep that attraction, the peonies and the ants, and that mutual relationship between them. And if you pick a peony and you're going to bring it in the house and put it in a vase and you see that there's some ants on it, just carefully dip it in some cool water, shake the ants off, and then your peony will be beautiful to bring into the house. Now, for safety reasons, everyone should learn about this myth. If a pesticide is organic or natural, it must be less toxic. No, the reality is that organic and synthetic pesticide toxicity is determined using the same standards. And believe it or not, some of you might not believe this, but it is true. There are some organic pesticides that have a higher toxicity than some of the synthetic pesticides that do the same thing. Now, all pesticides are labeled with a signal word: danger, warning, or caution. And of course, danger being the most toxic and caution being the least toxic. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Some of you may have heard of or even used the organic pesticide called rotenone, or you might have used or heard of the organic herbicide containing 20 or 30% vinegar. Both of these organic pesticides have the signal word danger, which means they are the most toxic. So before you use a pesticide, please do consider some other options first: cultural, physical, and mechanical. And I do want to let you know that our master gardener, Cheryl Borden, she actually did a 10-minute university webinar on integrated pest management. And if you look through that webinar, you'll be able to find all the ideas of how to use cultural, physical, and mechanical methods before you need to use a chemical. If you are going to use a chemical, always start with the least toxic. And please, please, please read all pesticide labels carefully before you use them, even the organic ones. Now, here's another myth that's been around for a long time, and unfortunately, it is still being sold to the public. Covering a tree's pruning cup with a pruning paint helps to protect the wound. No, it does not. The reality is that you painting over the wounds actually creates an environment that is prone to rot. You see, trees have their own built-in repair system, and that allows the wound to heal and to seal over time. Putting the paint on top of that wound is not going to help it, and it is going to hurt it. But unfortunately, wound paint is still being sold in the stores. But the best way to care for your tree is to use sharp, clean cutting tools and use proper cutting cuts. Those are the things that will help the tree repair its wounds, not the paint. Now, many of us have hard clay soils. So we have been told, just add more organic matter to the soil, add more organic matter to the soil. I've been told that a lot of times, and I know other people have told me the same thing. But once again, the research has found that adding too much organic matter at one time or even over time can lead to problems. Now, adding organic matter to your soil can help improve the soil structure, and it does help to promote long-term plant health. But the ideal amount of organic matter to add to the soil is only 5 to 8%. And to know if you have 5 to 8% organic matter in your soil, it would be a good idea to take a soil test. I have listed the link to the analytical laboratory serving Oregon, where you can send your soil in to have it tested. And you will tell them you want to know how much organic matter is in your soil. Now, if the organic matter in your soil is too much higher than 5 to 8%, that means that the soil can have too much available phosphorus. And if that happens, it can actually stunt the plant growth of your plants, and sometimes it can potentially leach into the water table. So 5 to 8%, don't overdo it. Did you know this one? Tree roots only go as far as the drip line. The reality is that most trees extend farther than the drip line. Here's some examples. Magnolias will extend 3.7 times farther than the drip line. Red maples and poplars 3 times farther than the drip line. Locust 2.9, ash 1.7. And that is why it is really important to know if you plan on digging in the area around a tree. You need to know that those roots go out a lot farther. So be aware of where you're digging. If you do dig and you ruin some of those roots, you know that's not going to be healthy for the tree. It might make the tree unhealthy or even kill the tree. So be aware of where those roots are actually at. How about this one? You should top a tree to control its height. That sounds logical? No, it is not. In reality, trees are programmed to attain a certain height. And if you top a tree, that rapidly growing suckers that are going to grow from the top of that tree are going to be weakly attached, and they can become a hazard. Also, it won't be long before the tree is going to end up being the same height as it was before you topped that tree. Master Gardener Sherry Shung did several webinars through the 10-minute university website that you can learn all about proper pruning techniques. So you also have to realize that the trunks are not limbs, so they can't seal the wound like I talked about when I was talking about not using wound paint. So learn, if you're going to plant a tree, learn about the tree's height and the habits before you plant that tree. And if you are under power lines, be very, very careful. And before you prune these trees, do check out those pruning guidelines. I think you'll find them very, very helpful. Oh, you are going to love this one. Deter moles with chewing gum, chocolate, human hair, mothballs, drain cleaner, etc., etc., etc. I'm sure you've heard of many, many more. Well, none of these remedies work, and some of them are actually harmful to the environment, harmful to pets, and harmful to people. You see, moles' diet only consists of earthworms and grubs. That's what they eat. They don't eat chewing gum. They're not even going to look at that chewing gum. And technically, you might not realize this, but it is not legal to use any unregistered material as a rodenticide. No matter how benign it must seem, it is not legal to do that. Now, there are molicides that are registered for use with moles, but their control is kind of limited. So the best way to catch moles is to use traps. Carefully set the traps, and those do work best. So please don't try any of these home remedies, and save that chocolate for Valentine's Day. How about this one? Dish soap repels aphids. Yes, we've heard that many times, and I will confess that before I took the Master Gardener course, I even tried it. Yeah, not good results. But the reality is, as tempting as the DIY recipes can be, homemade pesticides can be very dangerous. There are very few recipes that came from research-based sources. Now, dish soaps, did you realize that dish soaps, they are not soaps. They are actually detergents, and they are synthetically produced, and they are chemically designated to be powerful detergents. They are degreasers. And if you were to spray this soap on your plant, the degreasers can actually, and very easily, which happened to me, destroy the plant's leaf cuticle. Now, the cuticle of a plant, it is this protective covering layer that covers the leaves and the fruits and the flowers and the non-woody stems, and it helps to protect the plant. So putting these degreasers on is going to remove that protection from your plant. Now, even insecticidal soap, which we know is a very safe organic pesticide to use, even that needs to be applied very, very carefully. So it can injure the plants if you use it incorrectly. So like I mentioned before, please, anytime you're using any type of chemical, please read the instructions carefully. Now, here is a myth that has received a lot of publicity. The idea of using an organic herbicide really does appeal to many of us. But the myth is that corn gluten meal is an effective organic herbicide. Now, the key word here is effective. But in reality, corn gluten meal is not a selective product, nor is it effective on all types of weeds. Corn gluten meal it's a protein byproduct of corn mealing, and it's very high in nitrogen, 10%. Wow, 10%, that's pretty good. Some of the research has shown that it may be slightly effective in the Midwest United States, but corn gluten meal is not as effective in other climate zones, such as the Western United States. And in fact, there are no scientific data from the field trials done in the Western US to support the use of corn gluten meal in weed control. So the nitrogen that you see remember I said it was high in nitrogen? Well, that nitrogen, if you're using corn gluten meal, it can benefit the desirable plants, and it can also benefit the existing weeds, because corn gluten meal is made as a, excuse me, a pre-emergent. It doesn't affect the weeds that are already there. In fact, if you were to use it and there's already weeds there, that nitrogen that's in that corn gluten meal will actually make those weeds grow a lot more. And I'm sorry, but you'll find out that the cost of corn gluten meal is very high compared to the other control strategies. But If this is something that you really want to use, I recommend that you read all the research first, and then you can decide if this is going to work for your situation or not. Now, you're going to love this one. Green potatoes are deathly poisonous. I'm sure many of you have heard that before. Well, the reality is it would take up to 5 pounds of green potatoes. I don't know if I said tomatoes, I meant potatoes. It would take up to 5 pounds of green potatoes to make you sick. Potatoes are in the nightshade family, and the nightshade family does include a lot of toxic members. But the only parts of the nightshade plants that are poisonous are the green parts. They contain this toxin called solanine, and it is in all the green parts. And if your potato tubers are exposed to light, you will notice that they turn green. Then you know that the solanine is in that green part. So the FDA recommends that if you're going to eat a green potato, or if you see a green potato, all you need to do is peel off any of the skin, any of the shoots, or any of the green color, and that potato will be fine to eat. Just make sure you don't eat 5 pounds of it, or it's going to make you sick. Now, I'm going to tell you the legend of how green potatoes are deathly poisonous idea got started. And that is that the legend has it that Sir Walter Raleigh, in an effort to promote his potatoes, he gave the plants to the royal gardeners in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. And the gardeners gave them to her cooks. Well, her cooks threw away the tubers, but of course they were being good English cooks. So they boiled up the greens for this feast to celebrate this new crop. Well, that in turn made everyone in the royal court very, very sick. And that is how the legend began, that eating a green potato is poisonous. Grass clippings cause thatch. No, they don't. Thatch is actually caused by the rhizomes that are below ground lateral growth and the stolons, which are the above ground lateral growth. Now, bentgrass and Kentucky bluegrass do produce quite a bit of rhizomes and stolons, so you will get a lot of thatch when you grow those. But perennial rye and tall fescue, they don't produce much thatch, because they don't have hardly any rhizomes and stolons. That's not how they grow. And actually adding the grass clippings back onto your lawn will add nutrients back into the soil. So if somebody tells you, oh, don't add those grass clippings on your soil, because on your lawn, because it's going to cause thatch, you can tell them, nope, I'm sorry, you're wrong. That is not what causes thatch in your lawn. Lime will remove moss from your lawn. Okay, well, in reality, lime will raise the pH, but it will not remove the moss. Lawns with moss need more sunlight, and also moss grows when the lawns have a nitrogen deficiency, and also when they have a low pH. So adding lime is good for lawns because it will help raise the pH of your soil, but just remember, it won't remove the moss that's already there. So to help prevent moss in your lawns, you will want to keep your lawn as healthy as possible. So that will help to outcompete the moss, and give them regular fertilizer applications containing nitrogen and more sunlight. And if all of this doesn't work for you, you may have to use something that is specifically developed for moss removal. You may have to remove the moss first. Now, if you're trying to grow grass in a very shaded area, you might want to think about removing the grass completely and just planting some other things that will grow really well into that shade. Pine needles make soil more acidic. Some of you are thinking, yeah, I used to think so too. But actually, pine needles do not make the soil more acidic. You see, pine needles have a pH that is low, about 3.2 to 3.8 when they drop off of the tree. But as soon as they hit the ground, the needles that are left on the ground start to break down naturally. And all the microbes that are in the soil are going to help to neutralize those pine needles. So they're not going to have a low pH. They are really good for mulch. I have several pine trees in my landscape, and I scoop up those pine needles and I use them as mulch in a certain area of my yard, and they do work really well. You can put them in the compost pile, but just be aware that they break down slowly. They're not fast. They don't break down as fast as leaves and other things do. They break down a little bit slower in the compost pile, but they are not acidic. Now, this is a myth that is hard to get people to believe. Brown recluse and hobo spiders are common in Oregon, and they cause necrotic bites. The reality is that brown recluse are not found in Oregon, and hobo spiders do not cause necrotic bites. The brown recluse are established in 16 states, but they are mostly in the South Central Midwest. And we used to think that hobo spiders were venomous and they cause these necrotic bites. But through research, they have found out that they are not. So in 2015, the CDC removed the hobo spiders from their venomous spider list. The only venomous spider, potentially harmful one we have in Oregon, is the black widow. But the black widows are pretty shy and they stay in really, really dark areas. And they don't come out very often. People don't see them very often, and people aren't bitten by a black widow not very often. In fact, spider bites are not very common. Most of the wounds that we believe are from spider bites actually came from something else. So don't worry about them. Just enjoy the spiders that are outside, helping your landscape, helping you get rid of a lot of those bad insects. Drought-tolerant plants don't need watering. If you believe this, then all of those drought-tolerant plants that you put in will probably die, because even drought-tolerant plants need water the first year or two. You see, the first year, the plants are sending down roots so that they need that water to help support those roots. And then the second and third year, you will still need, maybe a little bit of infrequent watering. And of course, mulching will help to maintain the soil moisture and also help these soil microbes. But planting drought-tolerant plants is a great idea. Just remember to water those plants the first year or two. Now, larger trees, even though they say they're drought-tolerant, larger trees might need to be watered a little bit every summer. You'll be able to know by looking at your trees. But there's some research, and this is really interesting, that there are a couple exceptions. And thank you, Justin, for showing me this. The Western oak, the ceanothus, and the Pacific madrone need little or no extra water. And here's a really interesting fact about the ceanothus. If you water your ceanothus, it will live for maybe 5 to 7 years with summer watering. If you don't give it summer watering, it can live up to 35 years. Now, this is interesting because I know a lot of people that have tried to grow ceanothus, and they tell me, and I will admit, I killed one of my ceanothus also. They will say all of a sudden it grows fine for a few years and then just dies. Well, now we know why. And that beautiful ceanothus plant that you see on the right of the screen, I don't think that thing's getting any summer water. All right, adding sand to clay soils improves texture and drainage. The reality is, if you mix sand and clay together, you know what you're going to get? You're going to get cement. There is no amount of sand that's added to our clay soil that will help improve the texture of our soils. And actually, the problems occur even more when sand and clay are mixed together. Because see, when you mix a sandy and a clay soil together, the sandy soil has large pore spaces, and those large pore spaces are filled in with all the smaller clay particles. And that will result in an even heavier and denser soil than you had when you had only sandy or only clay soils. And it can even be more difficult to manage it than it is your original clay soil. So the best way, of course, to improve clay and sandy soil is with organic matter. Now, do you remember how much organic matter is good for our soils? That's right, 5 to 8%. Newly planted trees require staking. The reality is, if you plant a tree and it has a sturdy root ball and it's stable in the planting hole, it does not need to be staked. If a tree is staked tight and not allowed to move, it will actually become a very weak tree. It needs that movement to develop a sturdier trunk and a sturdier root system. Now, staking might be needed if you are in a real windy area or on a steep slope, But when you do, if you do need to stake it loosely. Allow it to move a little bit. That will help it grow the best way that it can. And only stake for a limited time. 1 season is all you need, just for 1 year. You can see the picture on the right. Obviously, 2 things wrong there. They staked that too tight and they forgot to remove it. And you know that that tree is going to have a lot of problems from now on. It's not going to be a nice, healthy tree. Add a handful of bone meal before planting trees or shrubs. Have you heard that before? I know I have. Unless your soil test shows that you have a deficiency of phosphorus, don't add it. You see, bone meal is primarily calcium and phosphorus. And our soils, the non-agricultural soils, I'm not talking about farms, but I'm talking about the rest of us, we actually have adequate calcium and phosphorus in our soils already. One thing that you might not realize either is that bone meal is mostly non-soluble. So that means it's not going to help the plants quickly. It's not accessible to the plants quickly. It takes it longer for it to do what you want it to do. And also having high levels of phosphorus, and I know I talked about this before too, having high levels of phosphorus from the bone meal can actually inhibit the growth of the mycorrhizal fungi. And these mycorrhizal fungi, I know it's hard to say that word, are an important part of the soil ecosystem. Specifically, the majority of plants, they form this partnership with the mycorrhizal fungi. And the fungi plays a really critical role in helping these plants. They help them take up water and nutrients through its roots. And we don't want to ruin that symbiotic relationship that the plants have. So that means we don't need excess phosphorus in our soil. You don't need to add that bone meal when planting your trees or shrubs. Now, I have heard many, many arguments about this one. Don't use pressure-treated wood in raised beds. And I know some of you right now are saying, that's right. Well, actually, nowadays, pressure-treated lumber is actually an economical, long-lasting choice for constructing your raised beds, because the pressure-treated wood that you buy now is treated with copper azole. I looked up how to pronounce that word, and it can be pronounced 3 different ways. So anyway, this copper, and is also labeled for ground contact and for residential use. If you want to use pressure-treated wood and you go to the store to purchase it, just read the labels. It'll say copper azole for ground contact and residential use. Now, over 20 years ago, we would have said, do not use pressure-treated wood, because the pressure-treated wood then was treated with an arsenic containing, it was a preservative, it was called CCA, and it had arsenic in it. And that wood used to be available to the general public, but it's something we told people not to use. So do not use salvage wood that's over 20 years old, because most of that will have contained that arsenic containing wood preservative. Now, also, one other thing, I wanted to mention railroad ties. I know some people use railroad ties in their landscape. You don't want to use the railroad ties around your food crops, because they contain creosote. Old ones and new ones do contain creosote. Now, some people are very concerned about the copper in the pressure-treated wood affecting their vegetables. But OSU research they've done a lot of research, and they show that there is no increase in the copper concentrations in the vegetables and herbs that were grown with this copper azole pressure-treated wood. Now, I want you to know something though. One of the resources that you'll be receiving about these talks, I want you to know that all the information that I'm talking about here about this pressure-treated wood, it was from studies done by OSU in the Willamette Valley area. So if you live in other parts of the United States, please look up that research first in your area. Find out what they have to say about the pressure-treated wood that's being used in the vegetable gardens in your area. That way we know that we'll all be safe. Now, our last myth might be even the most important one to remember. If it is published, it must be true. No, of course not. You know that. There's a lot of false information out there. So if you have a problem and you're looking up for information, there are some things that you can look for. Has that information been peer reviewed? And who has it been peer reviewed by? Is the information from an academic or a scientific publishing house or just a regular old publishing house? Okay. Have the experiments been repeated? Have they repeated these experiments? Not just once, but many times. And the idea must withstand repeated attempts to disprove it. All right. There are lots and lots of information out there about myths and debunking those myths. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk about gardening myths. And I'm always surprised to learn something new and something that I've been doing. I found out all these years later that it's a myth and it's something I shouldn't be doing. So now, oh, also, I forgot to tell you that there are so many resources out there about gardening myths. And the list of resources here will be sent to you in an email along with a recording of this webinar. So now Cheryl is my co-host and she'll join me. And hopefully we have some gardening questions that we can answer.
We do, Jane. That was a wonderful presentation. You know, it is so true that we hear things from other people that we judge to be, you know, great gardeners, and they give us some advice, and we continue to do those things. And sometimes it's not great advice. So I think we all learned at least one or two things from your presentation that we believed before that perhaps we are finding are not true. We do have a couple questions though, and this is a really good one because I know people they're wondering. This has on the topic of creating an interface, and you know, many people buy those large ceramic containers that take a lot of soil, and there are a number of books that suggest that you put empty containers inside there and then put soil in to kind of minimize the amount of soil you're putting in that container. Is that going to create an interface or a problem?
It's going to cause an interface, but you got to think, why are you putting that in there? Are you putting that stuff in the bottom of a giant container because what you're going to grow isn't going to be, the roots are going to be short and it doesn't need that much room. If those roots aren't going to need that much room, then go ahead and put some material in the bottom. But if you're growing something like, say, you're going to put a blueberry or some other type of shrub in a container, you know that that root system is going to need a lot of room. So you're not going to want to put something in the bottom of that type of container.
Excellent answer. You know, the other answer that's kind of a good one for this that I'm going to interject is because those hot pots are very, very hard to carry around and move. Hopefully you found a place where you love it. If you can find a pot that will fit inside that pot, so you kind of have a pot within a pot, you won't have the interface problem. And you can also just lift that pot out, change the plants and put it back in the pot, and you won't break your back either.
That is a great idea.
It
idea.
saved my bacon any number of times. Okay, so you talked about people who just kind of whack away at a tree, and you showed mostly deciduous trees that get whacked. What about conifers, pruning conifers, if they seem to be getting too high? Is that a problem?
Yes, that's still the problem because the rain is going to come down and that is going to rot. And think about how large an area at the top of that tree is. And when you top it, that's a large, large area for rot to enter. So never top a tree.
I know. It's very hard to select a tree now in our urban lots that are accommodate the size we have. We just don't have great large acreage. If you should be so lucky to have one, then that's a great thing.
One other thing, Cheryl, and I just forgot what it was. Okay, never mind.
Oh, it'll come back.
Boy, did that leave quickly.
If you're like, well, if you're like me,
I know what. Now I remember what it was.
Okay.
We've been told that if you read a plant tag and it says this will grow 15 to 20 feet, in Oregon, specifically in the Willamette Valley, they say add several feet to what this plant tag says, because in our area things grow really well and they grow a lot taller than the plant tags say they will.
Yeah, I agree. I've certainly been burned by that too, where the tree, I go, well, it didn't say that on the tag. This is on the topic of pruning limbs and not painting something on the limbs. They're wondering if are you kind of referring to small limbs, or if you take a large limb off the trunk, is the trunk affected in the same way a limb is? Should you paint the trunk if you've taken a big limb off?
No, never paint it. Even if you're taking a limb, a large limb off the side of a tree, the tree is going to heal itself. If that tree is healthy enough to do it, it will do it. By putting paint on it, it's going to harm it. So no matter how big it is, no paint. And some people used to put concrete.
Oh, I
And,
have seen that. I have seen
yes,
it. Yeah.
that does not work either.
Right, right. It's not a simple question. Are fir needles good for mulch?
Yes, fir needles are good for mulch too. And they don't have a high pH either. I mean, a low pH. They don't have a low pH either. Neutral.
Natalie also wants to know, she was very interested in what you had to say about pressure treated wood for raised garden beds. She's wondering if you've heard anything about any or seen any studies on corrugated metal being used for raised beds.
I have read a little bit, and they say that it does not, whatever comes out of the metal is so close to the metal itself that is not going to harm the vegetables or herbs or any food that plants that you're growing in there. So there has been studies done that said no, metal's okay too.
This question just came in from Tim. He's thinking about large cedar boxes, like 4x8, and he was going to fill them with potting soil, but that is very, very expensive for him. What would you recommend that he use for his big raised bed?
Oh, goodness sakes.
I know out there, there's lots available at the nurseries.
I know. And I don't think I'm a good person to tell him what to do. He needs to look at all the different ones out there and think, is this one going to work for me? Or is this one going to work for me? Or is this one going to work? But I would suggest he go around to some other places. A lot of churches and places have raised beds. Look and see how they did them and how other people that he may know did their raised beds. Find out, and also find out what they say works and doesn't work. You know, people will put in a raised bed and you hear a lot about oh, it's too short, or it's too tall, or this happened, or this happened. And did you know tomorrow we are having a webinar about raised beds?
Right. Tune in, because there'll be some great information about how to fill your raised beds and what's the best.
Yes.
Yeah, we are getting a couple questions too about the amount of organic matter that's in your raised beds. So a good advice. Stay tuned for tomorrow. This individual has 70% organic matter, feeling like that might be now, having seen what you have to say. That's too much organic matter, and they want to know how to amend it. So it's good advice. Stay tuned for tomorrow's.
Yes.
I had another question. Oh, this is kind of a cute question. Sprouts on, so you store your potatoes in the pantry, gets little sprouts on them. They want to know, are those harmful? Since you brought the topic
because they're yes, definitely cut off just cut down to the white part of the potato.
Mm-hmm. They aren't harmful. Okay. And we had one other question that I wanted to ask you about. People are using various things to fill in their raised beds. Raised beds are an issue. Tomorrow's webinar is going to be busy. Raised beds are, people are kind of anxious to get outside now that the sun is shining. So she says, to fill my space in my raised beds, I've been using branch and perennial cuttings, pine cones, and other garden waste to fill the bottom to create volume. And she's wondering if that's an okay thing to do. And I'm guessing you're going to say it depends on how much percentage of that is to the soil bed.
Yes, exactly. And tomorrow, Priscilla's going to do the raised bed. I garden in the ground, so I'm not as familiar with everything that has to do with raised beds. So tomorrow, Priscilla will be a great person to ask that question. And if you're not able to tune in tomorrow, you will get a link to that webinar.
Right. And Tim Minute University does have a couple of videos available on raised bed gardening, not only how to build them and what's safe to build them with, but on also what to fill them with.
Good.
And you know what, Jane, I have no more questions for you. That answers all the questions I have. And I'm going to just reiterate, which two varieties of tomato are less likely to get blossom end rot?
Celebrity and Jet Star. And there's one called, I never heard of it, called something fresh. I was reading about it, and I can't remember what that was. I've never heard of that brand before, but all I did was look up potatoes that are resistant to blossom end rot, and I found the information.
Yeah, they were listed. Okay.
In a university site. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. It's good advice, because people are now going to be out shopping for tomatoes. And if it's been historically a problem to have blossom end rot, it's good to start out with something that is a bit resistant.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Jane. You told us a lot, and we've got lots of feedback. People that are just like learning about these garden myths. So you've done a lot to inform us today.
Well, it was fun. Thank you for tuning in.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye.